You're listening to Boobies and Newbies, brought to you by the Frolic Podcast Network. Welcome to Boobies and Newbies, the podcast that asks novice romance readers to think outside the dick in a box and brave the unbridled world of erotica. I'm your host, Kelly Reynolds, and we have got a lot to talk about, starting with my latest project. Now, a while back, I asked if y'all were interested in a podcast that was all about the sexy bits, one in which readers could share their favorite steamy scenes from romance in a head-to-head battle of sorts for an unbiased judge. Well, thanks to your warm response and my overachiever tendencies, I am pleased to say this July we are launching Slick Summer Nights, a battle royale summer showdown between the steamiest scenes in romance. I will be putting the call out for participants, both for judges and contestants, sometime this month. So if you are interested and you've got a steamy scene that you just can't stop talking about, please look out for that. And as if that wasn't enough, in June, we are launching Tit Talk, a monthly panel discussion between the folks who write romance and the readers who love them on our YouTube channel. So look out for more details coming your way soon. And the best way to keep up with the latest from Boobies and Newbies is to find and follow the podcast across social media at Boobies Podcast. As always, you can listen to past episodes of Boobies and Newbies on your favorite podcast app or directly on our website, boobiesandnewbies.com. If you're a fan of the show and you've got a few minutes to spare, I would absolutely appreciate if you left us a review on Apple Podcasts. And last but not least, if you would like to show the podcast a little extra love and support, you might want to head on over to Patreon and share the love. We've got monthly patron-only events, sneak peeks, bonus clips, so much more, and you gain instant access to it for as little as $1 per month. You will find links to all of the above in today's show notes. Whew. And now, on to today's main event. Joining me today is co-host of The Talk of the Street, Helen Broom. The Talk of the Street is a weekly podcast hosted by husband and wife team Gavin and Helen Broom, where they recap that week's episode of the popular and long-running UK soap opera Coronation Street. Naturally, I have a lot of questions. Welcome, Helen.
Hi, thank you so much.
Thank you for being here. And I just have to start with saying I had no idea that Coronation Street was a thing. And shame on me, because honestly, I love British television. I guess I just never breached the gap into British soap operas. I've stuck by mysteries and romance all this time.
Yeah, it's great. There are a couple of British soap operas that are pretty long running and well known. There's Coronation Street, which we do a podcast on. There's also Emmerdale, which is a more rustic. It's not set in the city. Like Coronation Street is basically set in Manchester.
Okay.
And then there's EastEnders. So there's quite a selection of soap operas in the UK, and I find them really interesting because unlike a lot of American soap operas, they tend to focus on like more down to earth real people. It's not like Dallas. It's not like, a whole bunch of rich people walking around and everything. They're people who work in a factory making panties, for example. That's like the main employer of the street is a factory that makes lingerie called Underworld.
Of course it is.
Of course it is. And, and then there's just like little shops and everything.
Yeah.
On a hospital. So there's at least one doctor that shows up every once in a while. But really, there are a couple of lawyers on the street. And I think that's the most, person in an actual profession there is. Everybody else kind of works in like a kebab shop
Love it.
and a corner shop.
That's so interesting because and now that you've mentioned it, I have heard of EastEnders. I've never seen it, but
Hmm.
I guess when I think of like British culture in general, especially the way that Americans digest British culture,
Hmm.
we have such a fascination with like the crown and royalty that
Yeah.
that's always kind of like the first thing I think of when I think of Britain. So I guess I just assumed like, oh, if you're going to have a soap opera that's set in England, it's going to be about,
It's going to be really
the
posh.
rich, hoity-toity,
Yeah.
posh families that are like out to protect the family name
Hmm.
but we have enough of that in The Crown alone. We don't need more.
Right, exactly. Yeah, it's really interesting to see just normal everyday people. And even after all this time, they'll reference something in the show and I'll say, "What is that?" For example, a couple of weeks ago, somebody was talking about a lollipop lady, and I assumed it was somebody who sold lollipops.
Right.
But it's actually a crossing guard
Uh,
because
oh,
the sign looks like a lollipop.
and so
With the circle and the stand. Yeah.
interesting.
And I had no idea. I've been married to a Brit for almost 10 years now, and I had no idea. So,
And you're still learning.
every day's
Yeah.
every day's an education.
That's
Yeah.
so funny. Yeah, I will say I've watched my fair share of American soap operas, mostly because anytime I visit my Mimi, they're on the TV 24 hours a day. But
Mhm.
and I've seen a few Spanish soap operas, which give me all the
Oh,
spicy.
well, yes.
Like
Yeah.
that's just
Telenovelas are the best.
oh, so good. And then I want to say I kind of accidentally stumbled across a French one on Netflix and just kind of went along with it. But
Right.
I can't believe I've never watched a British one just because I love British television. Like I feel like I
Mhm.
watch so many British mysteries, but I think
Mhm.
it is interesting though that there's such a difference between like the types of characters that they're putting on British soap operas versus American and even Spanish soap operas too.
Right. Absolutely. I don't know if you've heard this little show on Netflix called Bridgerton.
Oh, I think I
Are you a
maybe a
fan?
time or two. Yeah, like maybe it's crossed my feed.
Phoebe Diviner, who was the lead in the first season.
Yes,
Her
Daphne.
mother,
Daphne. Mm.
her mother is on Coronation Street
Has she been on it for like ever?
for like a good 10 years or so.
Okay.
And I believe her husband is or was on one of the other British soap operas. I can't on the top of my head remember which one.
So it runs in the family.
Yeah, so
Got it.
Phoebe learned honestly learned acting, and sometimes in rather spicy situations.
Yeah.
Not as spicy as Bridgerton can get.
It was all to prepare her for the role of the lifetime as Daphne
Absolutely.
Bridgerton.
Yep.
Well, so before you met your husband, like, have you always been a fan of soap operas or more specifically Coronation Street? Or was this like a project that like the two of you just decided on together or started watching together?
Yeah, I hadn't heard of it until we got together. I didn't grow up a soap opera kid. There are two kinds of American mothers. There's either the soap opera mom or the game show mom, and I had a game show mom. So when
Yeah.
I was homesick, I wasn't watching soap operas. I was watching The Price is Right.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I really didn't have, I'd seen them once or twice, but I hadn't really watched very many of them. And then we had taken a weekend off and driven up closer to the lake, and we were staying at this hotel, and I just happened to turn on the television, and my husband was in the bathroom at the time, and this show came on. It was on the CBC because we're so close to Canada.
Got it.
And he came out of the bathroom and he's like, "That's Coronation Street. where on earth? How are we watching this? How is this on?" So that's when we initially started watching it. We went home and figured out the most recent season isn't on Hulu, I don't think, or it's a couple of weeks behind. We did find it on Hulu. I believe it's still on Hulu.
Wow.
Some of it. it got to a point where people in the house would just kind of it would be quiet, and all of a sudden somebody would start humming the theme song to Coronation Street. We initially started with a podcast called Common Language, and that's why, we call ourselves the Common Language Network, and that was kind of talking about the differences between British and American things, because there were so many like little things, like the lollipop lady, that are completely different. And so we thought it would be fun to research them and talk about them. And so that was going to be like the more research heavy podcast. And then my husband suggested that we do a more fun one. And that was Talk of the Street. We do have another podcast called The List of Lists, which is more of a pop culture podcast. We talk about what movies we've seen recently, and we're also going through the Rolling Stone 500 best songs of all time. So like every week we'll count down 5 songs.
Man, you guys aren't busy enough. You're like, let's start a third podcast, like no problem.
And then my husband and my daughter have a SpongeBob podcast called SpongeBob Squarecast.
Gosh.
Yeah, we stay busy.
Yeah, it's so funny because obviously I'm a solo podcaster that has a different guest every week, but I always love hearing the different like pairings of hosts for podcasts, because I feel like so many times people start one just to have a way to connect with, whether it's a family member or a friend that they haven't seen in a long time, and it gives them an excuse to have this day once a week where we talk about something that we have in common, or, for me, it's like, it gives me an opportunity to meet new readers, new friends, new podcasting pals. Like I absolutely adore this medium, especially during the last couple of years. It's been a great way to connect with people near and far.
Absolutely. Yeah. We've actually had quite a few listeners write in and say to us and thank us for the fact that we've kept going. They've said to us that, having something to listen to and laugh with and everything has really helped them get through the pandemic. And that just it kind of gets you.
That's what every podcaster wants to hear.
Oh my God.
I'm with you. Well, where can everybody find and follow you guys and listen to your 8 million podcasts that you have in circulation?
We're on, Apple Podcasts. We're on Podbean. And then Talk of the Street is on Twitter, as is List of Lists. And we have a YouTube channel for Talk of the Street.
Cool.
And then we are on Facebook.
Awesome. All the places.
All
the
places. Yep.
I'm excited. Well, I'm glad that you're, taking a break from the Coronation Street and SpongeBob and what have you to step into the world of romance with me, at least for an hour or so. And today, Helen and I are going to be discussing The Good Girl's Guide to Rakes by Eva Leigh. This historical romance was published recently, February 2022. It's available on Amazon for $5.99 Kindle edition. It's also the first book in Eva Leigh's Last Chance Scoundrels series. And I just want to give a quick special thanks to Avon and NetGalley for providing me with an advanced copy of this book. I am counting down the days until I can read the next one in the series. Like, no exaggeration, I inhaled this book. So I'm excited to talk about it with you today, Helen. But first, I just kind of want to know, what's your experience been with reading romance? Are you a newbie to the genre? Are you a longtime reader?
Well, I'm not a newbie, but it's not the genre that I pick up these days.
Okay.
Automatically. It's not the first thing that I go to.
Mm-hmm.
When I was younger, my uncle used to own a hotel in Montana. We would spend our summers there, and we would help clean the rooms, and we would find romance novels. We'd find other things too. We would find things a little slightly more risque than romance novels, but we would find the romance novels were the things that we could pick up and read by the pool and everything after we were done helping clean the rooms.
Who are these people leaving behind books in hotel rooms? You should be taken outside and paraded around in shame. Like, this is unacceptable.
Hey, if you're educating young minds by leaving your reading materials behind, that's
right. It was a conscious choice. You didn't
right.
know it at the time, but they left those for the purpose
Just for
of
me.
you or somebody else finding them to then read and enjoy themselves.
Yeah, I mean, even now, I mean, if I'm staying at like a B&B or something and they have like a bookshelf there, if I've brought a book with me and I finish reading it and it's not something that's special to me, like a signed copy or something like that, I might leave it, and then I have room in my bag for new books.
More new
right?
books. You always got to make room for more books.
That's right. So in my teens and my early 20s, I think I read an awful lot of romance, but these days I mostly read historical nonfiction, sci-fi, specifically like time travel sci-fi is something that I'm really into. And then, I read a lot of comic books and graphic novels.
It's funny, when I first picked this book for us, I didn't know about your podcast and the fact that it focuses on a British television show, but it's kind of fitting that we're reading a historical novel set in England. So there you go. Just take you back a few hundred years or so.
Right?
So let me give everyone the brief synopsis for today's read, and then we will dive into our discussion. So once again, this is The Good Girl's Guide to Rakes by Eva Leigh. When Kieran Ransome's latest antics result in a massive scandal, his father issues an ultimatum: find a respectable wife or inherit nothing. But as one of London's most inveterate scoundrels, I don't know if I've ever actually read the word inveterate, so that's exciting. Kieran doesn't know any ladies who fit the bill, or does he? Celeste Kilburn is a society darling. I have to pause for a second just to commend Eva Leigh on the names Celeste Kilburn and Kieran Ransome, because I don't think I've read many Celestes in romance, and I really don't think I've read any Kierans, so well done. Celeste Kilburn is a society darling, beloved by influential members of the ton, but keeping a spotless reputation leaves little room for adventure, and she longs to escape her gilded cage, especially with her impending engagement to a stuffy earl. When Kieran, her older brother's best friend and an irresistibly attractive rogue, begs for her help, Celeste makes a deal. She'll introduce him to the right social circles if he'll show her the scandalous side of London. In between proper teas and garden parties, Kieran escorts Celeste, disguised as Salome, to rowdy gaming halls, wild fetes, and sensual art salons. As they spend more time together, their initial attraction builds to a desperate desire that neither can ignore. But when someone discovers their midnight exploits, Celeste's freedom and reputation are endangered, and Kieran must save the woman he loves, respectable or not. Ooh. Okay, I have lots of things to say, but of course I would love to turn it over to you and just ask for overall thoughts, initial impressions. What do you think?
This was a fun read. It was an easy read. It was something that I was able to just, it's over 300 pages, but it maybe took me 3 days to read it. And that was with lots of other things going on. I especially appreciated the sex scenes because, there is, even though this is supposed to be this, awful rake, there's a side of him, and it's a believable side that still seeks consent.
Yeah. Oh,
and
yeah.
The way that it is written is believable for the times as well. Even now, there's an awful lot of romance out there that doesn't have any indication of consent. There's still, in an age after things like Game of Thrones, there's still an awful lot of rapey stuff out there that people, because the show was so successful, people are like, oh, this is what people want. No, that's not what people want.
Yeah.
That's not why the majority of people were watching the show.
I will argue that I do think you get a lot more of that in genres outside of romance where it's
Mm-hmm.
somebody including sex and relationships within the book. That it's not necessarily
Right.
what we would call a romance novel, but it's a sci-fi novel with a romantic storyline, or it's a
Right.
fantasy novel with
Yeah.
a woman and her dragon. You know, I don't, but
Right, yeah.
but you're right. They're absolutely. I mean, that's not to say that every romance novel that's published today is establishing clear consent between characters. That's not the case. Absolutely.
And you're absolutely right, because besides Game of Thrones, the thing that I was thinking of most when my husband and I first got together and everything, so many people, when they found out that my husband was Scottish, were like, "Oh my God, you have to read Outlander. You have to watch Outlander."
Yep.
Blah,
Saw
blah,
that
blah, blah,
coming.
blah. And you know, personally, I don't like them. You know, because there is an awful lot of rape or implied rape in both the show and in the books, that and I don't think that the LGBTQ characters are written very well. But, you know, it's a lot of people would say that those are romance novels, but they're also historical fiction. They're also time travel. You know,
Yeah.
so sci-fi books.
Outlander's an interesting one. It's one where I've seen the first 2 seasons of Outlander. I haven't read any of the books. I don't necessarily think of it as a romance, but I'm sure there are plenty of people who would disagree with me. I always kind of lope it in more with the same genre I would think of Game of Thrones with, just because there's so many other storylines going on that
Right.
what romance is there is part of the story, but I don't know if I consider it like the central plot. And for me, a romance places the romantic storyline as the A plot, as opposed to whatever else is going on, whether it's a workplace related thing or a saving the world related thing. That to me is always the B plot in a romance.
Right. Yeah.
But no, I'm with you. It's been a while since, and I know I released a historical romance episode fairly recently for the podcast, but it's been a while since I actually read a historical romance. And I think it's just because with contemporary, I read them quicker. I read them quicker. It's written in, you know, language that my friends and I use today, and it's just easier to digest. And I am an impatient person, so I want to read them quickly. I will say I powered through this one. I absolutely powered through, finished this very quickly, much quicker than I was anticipating. And I've read Eva Leigh before. I will continue to read Eva Leigh because I love what Eva brings to her books. Like, there's a good amount of folks out there who are not a fan of historical romance being written today. And I think it's because they see a lot of contemporary issues or language or actions that are being placed in a historical context. For example, conversations about consent, or the fact that, you know, the heroine Celeste is just as eager of a sexual person as Kieran is. And I think that there's a lot of people who maybe have been reading historical romance for a long time, or historical romance from decades past, that this is like this is a transition for them.
Yeah.
I love it. Personally, I love it. I find it so much easier to read, so much easier to enjoy, because it feels like we're giving things that we're talking about today a different context. We're just putting them into a different location. And so you have a book like this where even just like for a moment, we experience a couple men who are together. We experience a woman who's going to like go have a threesome with like some dude and a hot lady dressed in velvet. And we have characters of color. We have, you know, there's so much where I think a lot of people might assume, oh, well, you can't talk about that in a historical romance. We can't have representation in a historical romance. This is a great example. Yes, you can. You can. And it's it works. So
Right.
I commend Eva Leigh for making that happen.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And, people who do that, people who complain about stuff like that, it's like they think people during that time didn't have sex.
We're all
Or
cishet,
were all,
white, chaste.
there were Black people in the UK at this time. Of course
Yes.
there were gay people in the 1800s. The
Absolutely.
1700s. This is not historically inaccurate for
No.
people behind closed doors in these private parties to be doing these things. It's ridiculous. Like, I recently watched the limited series Around the World in 80 Days starring David Tennant. And while I was watching it, I was kind of like looking through some of the Letterboxd reviews. And there was this one guy who was so indignant that, a woman stagecoach driver in 1872 was being flirty with David Tennant. It's like, first of all, it's David Tennant. Of course she was.
I was going to say, if the person looked like David Tennant, all the
Come
power
on.
to you, sweetheart.
and second of all, do you think women didn't flirt in the 1800s, especially in the Old West? Come on.
Yeah.
Now.
I'm not sure what the problem is. Is it that she was a stagecoach driver, or
Right.
is it that she was flirting? Like, what's the issue here?
Yeah. Yeah. Maybe instead of watching this, maybe go and pick up a book and, learn some history.
Yeah. I think for a lot of misconceptions that people have about the romance genre in general, a lot of them apply to historical romance, because I think for a lot of people who don't read romance, the main image they get when they think of romance novels or hear about romance novels is a historical romance.
Right.
It's
Fabio
on the cover. It's a bodice ripper. It's, bosoms out, chest heaving. And I think this is a great example of a modern historical romance, because they are having conversations about consent. We are seeing representation of characters from marginalized groups that we haven't seen in historical romance novels in the past. And then at the same time, there are still so many factors at play that are so rooted in historical romance, like the fact that, we have in the one family, there's basically two families going on in this book. And
right.
I expect to see more from both of them throughout the next two books, because the main three men are these scoundrels, the last chance scoundrels. And we have Kieran.
Right.
Kieran as our main lead in this one, as well as his brother Finn. They're part of the Ransome family. They also have a sister, and I'm kind of curious if she's going to come back later on. I don't know. But their sister was engaged to marry Dom, who happens to be the older brother of Celeste, our heroine in this book. So there's a lot of both of these families coming together and basically demanding their sons to get married, fix their reputations, not only for themselves, but for the family. So we see a lot of societal pressure on the men, but also, and I would expect nothing less, on the women, because Celeste is really the one woman that we follow through this story. There aren't a lot of other female characters other than her friend, who I'm kind of wondering if she's going to play more of a part in future books. And we meet a couple other society women who are potential suitresses for Kieran. So,
and then there's is it Daisy, who's the servant of Celeste?
Yes.
Yeah.
Loved her.
She plays a part too.
Yeah.
Yeah, Rosalind was a really interesting character. I didn't know until after I had finished the book and was on Goodreads that this was going to be part of a series of books.
Got it.
So at the end, I was kind of frustrated because there's all these
other people.
There's all these threads that were never tied. What I was expecting was that Finn and Rosalind were going to get together and be one another's beards, essentially.
Ooh.
Because, we know Rosalind is at least bisexual, if not lesbian.
Yes.
And Finn and the older brother, Sebastian, I believe his name is.
Oh, Simon.
Simon. Yeah. I knew it started with an S.
Yeah. And you know what? There's a lot of Simons and Sebastians in romance.
Both of them felt a little queer-coded. Like, I fully expect that there's something going on between Simon and the Earl that Celeste is supposed to be marrying.
Interesting.
Because Finn seems more interested in cards and gambling and that side of being a rogue.
Yeah.
Than the sex stuff. That seems to be not quite as much of a focus. And Rosalind, there was one scene towards the end at the ball where Rosalind says something about going to play cards. So I was like, oh, is that kind of hinting that maybe they're going to make one another respectable?
I hate to dash your dreams because there is already a synopsis out for the second book in the series, and Finn has been matched with somebody else, Tabitha Seaton. In fact, I think it's the woman that he wants to match Dom up with, but
the blue stocking.
Yes, I think it's going to be a story of like him trying to like match her up with his friend, but really like falling for her in the process, which is I'm also fine with, and totally understandable. That you wouldn't necessarily see the threads for like the next few books. As an avid romance reader, I've been trained to think that way. So basically anytime I see, we've got 3 scoundrels and they're best friends and brothers, great, they're each going to get a book. So then I'm like looking out for, okay, well, who's his girl going to be? Okay, like who's going to bring you to your knees? Like,
yeah.
But if you're not an avid romance reader, I don't think that's necessarily like where your thoughts would go either. So I understand that. I am very excited though for the next 2 books because I really do like both Finn and Dom as well. Like I do want Rosalind to get a story. I do really want Rosalind to have a story. And so part of me is holding out hope that maybe she and Dom will get together, but I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, like I said, it just, because she's clearly, there's a couple of places where she talks about being with girls, and there's another part where Celeste says something about how, well, at least she can be with someone that she loves. And that Rosalind doesn't necessarily have that luxury. Although at the time, 2 women could live together and nobody would bat an eyelash.
Sure.
Sure. It would just be, they wouldn't be able to necessarily
be out in public,
hold hands and stuff in public. But then again, straight people weren't doing that either.
Yeah. Honestly, I think one of the things that struck me as different in this book that I hadn't thought about before, and I really can't recall reading as much in historical romance, is that the three male leads, Dom, Finn, and Kieran, they all share like a flat together. And I feel like most of the time in the historical romance I've read, it's either that the hero has a place unto himself or that he lives with his family and he supports his family. So that was a little bit different for me. But this is also, we're talking about both Finn and Kieran are the second and third sons in their family. And this is actually, ironically, the second historical romance we've read this season for the podcast that's focused on the second or third sons in a family as opposed to the first, the ones who usually inherit the title. And Dom has an interesting situation which kind of plays into Celeste's background as well, in that their family does not come from money, that their father basically earned his way into society. And so there's an added pressure for Celeste to make a great marriage match in order to keep that place in society, if not elevate them further. So I liked that a lot. I liked that there was more pressure for her, honestly, than there was for Kieran. The worst thing that can happen to Kieran is he loses his parents' financial support, but we find out he's one hell of a poet, so I think he'll be okay.
There you go.
But I liked a lot of the setup and the backgrounds for both families, and I think it was done in a way that didn't detract from the romance, because I think sometimes in the first book in a series, and this goes beyond romance, across genres, we set up so much background and exposition and character details that we kind of don't focus as much on the central story for that specific book. And then when we go on to the next books, because we've already set all that up, we can like keep moving forward. But I'm glad that we still had plenty of time to watch Kieran and Celeste fall in love. They had their dates. Some of them were by day, some of them were the naughty ones at night. And I loved that. Like, I saw so much of myself in Celeste. Like, I absolutely adored her character.
You know, for me, I kind of wish that there was a little bit more background as far as Celeste's family and how, because this would not have been an easy thing for a family to do. To raise themselves up and to earn, you know, it was very, very difficult because they were, you know, he was like a dock worker at first. He wasn't even, you know, at a businessman's level or merchant level. So he would have to go from, you know, poor to merchant level to the upper crust. There would have been a lot more steps there. So I kind of wish that there had been more explanation for that. It was kind of vague about,
leasing warehouses.
To buy warehouses.
Yeah. And then like renting them out.
To do that, it would be like, because they were living all in like one room and they didn't have enough food to go around and they didn't have
She and
shoes.
Dom are constantly masking their Cockney accents that they've like buried inside of them.
Yeah. So, you know, for that, I kind of wished that there had been a little bit more. But again, I'm coming at it as somebody who understands the history of the time, which not necessarily everybody would have coming into this. And I agree with you, you know, other than that, you know, there really was and I think this is why it was so easy to read. The focus on the story stayed very, very focused on the two protagonists. There weren't like chapters that went off in another direction.
And no weird subplots. I feel like a lot of romances I read, there'll be like a bunch of other characters that all have names that sound close to the same, or it's like Samson, Simon, Sebastian, and Sarah. I'm like, oh my God. Like, so I really did appreciate that as well, that a good chunk of the story was focused just on Kieran and Celeste. And then you would get little side moments with Celeste and her friend Rosalind, and you would get moments with Kieran and his friends Dom and Finn, his brother. And that was pretty much it. Like, there's her, you know, dick bag of a almost fiance that's like out to tie her to him, and thankfully that gets solved. But even with that, I did appreciate, I've said this before, I've gotten very attached to, instead of there being some awful misunderstanding or conflict between the couple, I like when it's an outside force that kind of splits the couple apart, just because then it's about them. You don't have doubts about them as a couple moving forward. It's just how are we going to tackle this issue that's standing in the way of us being together. And that just gives me a lot more ease, a lot less anxiety to move forward. And they do handle it, and it works out. It works out well. And then at the same time, anytime you have a best friend's brother, or no, it would be her brother's best friend or his best friend's sister. I feel like too often that trope is tied to the sibling involved getting like super pissed and, you know, overbearing that their friend is dating their sister. And I'm glad that wasn't the case. Dom was, I mean, at first
there was a little bit of that. I mean,
it's very
Dom tries to
minimal though. Like, it's
break Kieran in two.
I mean, not really. Like, at first he asked them like, what are you doing with my sister? And, Kieran tells him like, oh, it's not what you think. Like, we're doing this thing for me to like enter society.
Right.
And then when it gets to the point where he actually does tell Dom he loves his sister, Dom just asks him, and does she love you back? Like, and I was like, I'm glad this isn't turning into like an all out brawl, that this isn't, you know, I'm going to keep you away from her. Like, cause that's also like a great sign of not only him being an awesome brother, but a great friend. Yeah. So yeah, I appreciated that. Knocking a bunch of tropes, like in ways we've seen them in the past. So I appreciate that.
Absolutely. For the most part, it really felt believable. And like I said, it really focused, the focus was very clear. And even when you had other people come in, they were coming in to interact with these two people, either together or separately. It was all part of the same story. You didn't get like all these subplots and stuff. There was enough for me to start thinking in my mind, oh, is this going to happen? Is this going to happen with these other people eventually? And then it didn't, because those will be in the other books.
Yes. You'll just have to wait.
And I also appreciated, for the most part, the language was of the time in a way that made it readable, but didn't take you out of that time.
Yeah.
I appreciate the word cunt.
Oh, girl, you and me both. Let's talk about it.
I appreciate the word cunt. And quim. I have to say, though, pussy took me out of it, because pussy is a 20th century reference to.
I don't know. I think people will fight you on that, because there are a lot of historical romance writers who will lay it out for people in terms, because I think a lot of people do question, like, I mean, we've already said it, but people were having sex during this time. People were having dirty, raunchy sex during this time. But a lot of people tend to question there being explicit sex in historical romance. And this is definitely a book to read if you have those doubts, because it is explicit 100%. And they do use cunt. He says, I want to fuck you. And I can't tell you the like origin of the word pussy, but I would believe that it was in this context.
Right. And I mean, cunt is ancient.
Oh, for sure.
You know, cunt is an ancient word, and, you know, has gone through so many manifestations. And to me, it is such a British word.
Oh, yeah.
You know, you use the word cunt to describe your friends.
Yes.
You know, you use the word cunt to describe people you like and that you don't like.
I love that. And
it's the British equivalent of Smurfs saying Smurf for everything.
That's so funny. What a great comparison to make. I never would have thought of Smurfs, but no, that's so funny. And I like it, and I like that Celeste likes it too. I like that she likes when he says, I want to, lick your cunt. I love when he's like, come sit on my face. I was like, it was a lot of stuff in the sex scenes were things that I've seen in contemporary romance that I haven't necessarily read in historical. I don't see a lot of face sitting in historical. I don't see a lot of a character specifically saying like what they want to do to the person. That to me, I mean, we're getting into our sexcerpts here, I suppose, but one of the hottest parts to me was before he even like touches her, they have this whole scene in the alcove, because there's always a naughty scene in the alcove. It's either an alcove, a library, or like a dark garden. Like there's gotta be one.
Or an alley.
Yes. And he basically just tells her like in hushed tones, like, this is what I want to do to you. And I was like, oh my God, this is original sexting right here, but in person. Right. Like it's naughty talk up against the wall, and it's delayed gratification at its finest. So I loved that scene. I honestly marked like 4 different sexcerpts. So I'll let you share a favorite first, and then I'll just pick one of the other ones that you didn't pick to share for mine.
Okay.
So did you have a standout favorite that you wanted to share a piece of.
Yeah, so this is the first real sex scene that we get in the theater.
Mm-hmm.
In the dressing room.
Oh, I love that too. My theater kid inside of me was dying at the fact that the first time they do it, it's in the backstage of the theater.
What theater kid hasn't, after a show, just hung out and everybody sings songs and talk about stuff and goof off and make fun of one another after a show? I mean, that's totally, for me, the most relatable scene in the whole book.
Oh yeah. Well, and I know more than,
maybe not the stripping part, but
I don't know. I know more than one person who lost their virginity in my high school theater. So anyway,
this is the first scene of penetration, of actual penetration. Mm-hmm. It may hurt a bit at first, he said, his deep voice anchoring her. I'll do my best so that the pain doesn't last. I trust you, Kieran, she said, as she looked into his eyes. He gave a deep rumble and then positioned himself between her open legs. The crown of his cock met her entrance. The entrance kind of meh, but anyway.
That's honestly one of the least cringy words. At least for me, there's a lot more that are worse.
Yes. I've had worse said to me, so I totally believe it. And she and Kieran panted heavily as he paused there. Was this what it felt like in the moments before the world utterly changed? She was a little afraid, but she desired that transformation more than anything she'd ever wanted. Hold tight to me, he said hoarsely. She gripped his shoulders as her legs wrapped around his waist, her body slick and shaking. Kiss me, he demanded. Bowing up, she brought her mouth to his. At the same time, his hips thrust forward and he buried his cock in her. She couldn't stop the little yelp of pain that leapt from her lips. When he moved to pull away, she held him tightly. Stay, she whispered, stay, only I need a moment. Is it too painful, love? He huffed out. I've never been with a virgin before. I'd destroy myself if I didn't make it good for you. It is, Kieran, you are. She blinked away the sudden appearance of tears. But his candid admission touched her, as did his desire to please. I think I'm ready to keep going. Like so? As he spoke, he drew his hips back, and then slowly thrust forward once more. Ecstasy pierced her. Like so. And this? And this? Each question was punctuated by another stroke of his cock, and every time more and more pleasure streaked through her.
Mm-hmm.
So I picked that part because, like I said, it's the way he's very slow with her, the way he makes sure that this is what she wants.
Yeah.
And when she says, okay, slow down, he slows down.
Yeah.
It's not, oh, yeah, I get to, deflower a virgin.
No, I love that
sort of thing.
There's never any fetishization of the fact that she's a virgin. She herself doesn't make a big deal of it either. In fact, he multiple times asks her, you're almost engaged to this other person. How is this going to be okay? For us to do this and then you go marry somebody else? And she's like, it's my body. I'm making this choice. I want to do this with you. So I loved her agency that she had throughout the book, but especially in the sexual situations.
Yeah, and she's very upfront with him. She's like, you've done this before. You've done this a lot. You know how to not impregnate me, right? And he's like, yeah, absolutely.
I got you.
Yeah, okay, he uses a pull-out method, but honestly,
sign of the times.
In a lot of romance novels, especially older romance novels, the ones that I'm more familiar with, that wouldn't have happened. Mm-mm. And it would have been considered romantic for him to not do that, to just go all the way and
fetish
me. And like you said, the fetishization of the virgin. Yeah. There's so much more to it. There's it's more about her coming into her own and realizing who she is as a human being and not a piece of property, which is the way her father's treating her.
Well, and honestly, let me take a break from sexcerpts because there's a quote that I highlighted that is not sexy whatsoever. However, it really struck a chord with me. And it was one of those ones where I was like, interesting that this is a conversation they're having in, 1800 something. And this could very well be a conversation that a woman has in 2022. And she's talking to Kieran about the expectations put upon her by her family.
Right.
And it seems like both the men in her family unknowingly have done so, because when she does eventually have a conversation with them, they're like, what? We did this? Huh? But she says, I believed other people kept me in line, reining me in, but perhaps they've done such an effective job of telling me what I can't do. Now I tell myself what's impossible. And I don't know if there's a woman today who could not connect with that sentiment in some way.
Oh, absolutely. And yeah, it's imposter syndrome.
Imposter syndrome, the patriarchy. Oh, I mean, there's your bingo check for the patriarchy in this episode. But yeah, I mean, it is amazing how many times we do bring up something like the patriarchy in romance, in the discussions about romance novels, because so many of the characters and the choices that they make are results of how the patriarchy affects even the fictional characters in our worlds. And it does so because there's still an element of realism in them, whether they take place in the 1800s or today. And that's just happens to be a piece of our lives. So, that was something that really struck a chord with me. But anyway, back to the sex scene.
Anyway.
You know what? I think I'm actually going to share, it's the same scene, but it comes in earlier before they get down to business. And what I loved about this is that from like page 3, Kieran establishes that he's obsessed with women's necks. Like one of his first things he talks about when he sees Celeste at the church when Dom is supposed to be marrying his sister is, some men love breasts, other men love legs. I love a neck. And so in the beginning of this sex scene, before they do have sex, he starts nibbling a little bit on her neck. So I'll share a bit from this. It's so funny I say he loves necks. That sounds like he's either really romantic or he's like a serial killer, Jack the Ripper.
Yeah. There were moments where he's like, he longed to sink his teeth into her neck.
Yeah, just
wait. I was like, is this a vampire novel?
Here it
and
comes.
I just didn't know.
Here it comes. I've got the receipts for you. Starting with Kieran sank down to his knees. Do you know, he said, his voice feral, how long I've wished to see you like this? She shook her head, mute with arousal. For so very long. As he spoke, he leaned close, his mouth a mere inch from her skin. My thoughts and body are consumed with desire for every inch of you. And this neck, your gorgeous neck. She shivered as he dragged his lips along her throat. I want to bite this neck, he growled. Hold you still while I fuck you and fuck you. I want to mark you like I'm a goddamn beast. Yeah, no, this is like werewolf Kieran coming out right now. Celeste cried out when his teeth sank softly into her skin. Punctuation marks of pleasure. Love that sentence. At the same time, his hand stroked over her belly and caressed her breasts and skimmed along her hips. He was everywhere, and pleasure was everywhere. The fabric of the chaise rubbed against her back, its roughness adding to the sensations. He pinned her with his mouth and teeth as she writhed beneath him, her legs shifting restlessly as she sought relief from the growing need. She clung to his shoulder with one hand and brought the other to her aching sex. I'd like to do that for you, he rumbled against her skin. By all means, she managed to exhale. Yeah, no, for sure. Like the minute you start talking about a neck, I'm like I'm in full on vampire mode. And honestly, only thing that could have made this book better is if Kieran happened to also be a vampire. Like I totally 100% would have been okay with that. They could have a whole underground vampire league and I would be fine with it. But That's another book for another day.
Right?
Well, let's go ahead then and dive into our rankings. So on Boobies and Newbies, we rate for heart, humor, and heat on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the very best that it could be for you, objectively, of course. And so let's start with heart. What do you think?
For me, I would rate it as an 8.
Okay.
I thought that there was an awful lot of heart in this, especially towards the end, and not just between Celeste and Kieran, but between their families.
Yeah.
And everything. Mostly, Celeste's family. Kieran's family is still totally messed up.
Yeah.
But I'm sure, like I said, I'm sure we'll get to that in the other books. But I think for me, it comes close to a 10, but it's not quite a 10. I think because they both in the beginning had ulterior motives, that kind of gave me pause as far as heart's concerned. And then, honestly, I felt like at the end, the way her father comes around, not Dom necessarily, because I think Dom genuinely had no idea what her father was forcing her into.
But
the fact that her father turns around so quickly,
yeah,
when we've seen scene after scene after scene of her trying to explain this to her dad, and him totally shutting her down and not understanding where her heart is, not just for Kieran, but for the people they left behind. It kind of took me out of it a little bit, and it
was a bit of a quick wrap up as far as like her relationship with her dad is concerned. I do agree with you on that, because I do think there was a difference between him and Dom in what they were essentially making her do by, seeking out this shitty earl that she was going to marry, because I think Dom just genuinely didn't really have a clue that that's where this pressure was being placed on her. But I think her dad did know for sure.
Yeah, he absolutely knew.
And it was still with good intentions, in that it was never about her happiness. It was about
the family.
This is something I think would be good for you. This is something I think would be good for the family. What I think was missing that I would have loved to have seen was like a scene where he's talking to her about like the relationship he and her mother had. And
yes.
I kind of got the idea that, unlike Finn and Kieran's parents, I thought her and Dom's parents were a love match, that they had like a great life together. And I feel like I would have loved maybe a little more insight into their relationship, because I think just by her having that conversation with him, it would have affected him and his attitude and how he turns it around at the end to be like a little bit more believable when he sees that she's so in love.
Yeah, absolutely. Because you're right. It did feel more like they were a love match. And it also kind of felt like, from some of the stuff Celeste says and some of her interior monologue, that her mother wasn't necessarily happy or comfortable with this rise through the classes. That might have been part of why she died. That it was of a broken heart and just being miserable and depressed, being stuck in this big house with nothing to do. So it would have been nice to have had that conversation, talk about his love for her. And have that be a realization, I messed up with your mother. I'm not going to mess up with you if this is what you truly want.
I agree. And I don't know if we'll get that in Dom's book, because I don't necessarily see that being the conversation between father and son. But
no,
that's okay. That's okay. Aside from them kind of wrapping things up fairly quickly, and maybe not getting like as much of a resolution as I would have wanted with each of the families, I do think there's a lot of heart in this story, between the friends, between siblings, between lovers. So I probably will give it like an 8.5 or a 9. Like this is by far one of my favorite reads of 2022 so far, because I think it touched on a lot of the things that personally I look for in romance. And so that makes me happy. Humor, on the other hand, I'm interested in to hear your number because I did find several things funny. Like, I think they have great banter, but would I think of it as like a laugh out loud rom-com? I don't know.
Yeah, no, I gave it a 5 for humor because
Fair.
And in fairness, I don't think she meant this to be a funny book. It felt like there were a few attempts at humor and they just didn't land for me. But again, it was like offhand comments between the men intending to be funny. And I'm just like, that's not my sense of humor anyway. So,
and I loved the banter between the two of them. I think there was some great, like, banter. It's like a 9 for me, but humor overall, I'm with you. I would probably give it a 5. I might even give it a 4 because it's not what I think of as like a haha kind of book. I wouldn't recommend it to somebody who's looking specifically for an uproarious comedy. That being said, if you do like some like witty banter, especially between like the folks who are pursuing each other, I think that it is good for that.
Absolutely.
How about the heat?
I gave that an 8 as well.
Okay.
Like I said, I really appreciated, the nods to consent, and I felt like it was handled in a really great way. There wasn't an awful lot of it. There's only like really the scene that we read, and then there's a scene without full penetration before this, and then there's a scene afterwards towards the end.
It all comes in the second half of the book too, because I was thinking like, oh, there's not a ton in it, but then once you get to like the first time they have some sort of sexual encounter, it does happen a lot for the rest of the book. Like through the whole book, not so much, but the second half of the book, it happens several times.
Yeah.
So
I was expecting at least one sex scene with someone other than Celeste.
Really?
Because this guy is a rake. This is what he does,
Okay.
And we got more of kind of this goofy guy that doesn't take his responsibilities very seriously and goes out and parties all the time. But we didn't really get, he talks about it an awful lot, but we don't get to see him be a sexual rake with anyone else. So it kind of felt like it needed that, and we didn't, and we didn't get it.
I will say that's very rare to find in a romance novel. Like even if he is a rake or a rogue or however they characterize him, I could probably count on one hand the amount of romance I've read in the last decade where a main character has had sex with another character other than the love interest in a book. Like that's it. Not that I'm opposed to it because I have read it before and I have read it in historical before. So it's out there, but we definitely don't see it a lot.
Yeah, we don't get an awful lot of his rakishness, except in stories. Even beyond the sex stuff, he seems like a really decent guy. Like the way he paid the debt of the young man in the gambling hall.
Yeah.
And everything, and the way that he talks about women. This is where I think it would be okay if we saw him having sex with another woman is the fact that throughout the book, within, the sex scenes and also the interior monologue, he's always talking about how it's so unfair on women that they don't have the freedom to play the field the way that he does. And how important it is for him that he gives as much pleasure to the woman as he's getting himself.
Right. I guess my question for you is, what do you think of as a rake? Because maybe this is a question of how you define what a rake is, too. Like, I mean, because for me, a rake is somebody who I think we often associate it with some sort of sexual activity, like in general. Like there's usually
promiscuous.
Yeah, there's gambling usually involved and partying. But at least for me, I don't think of a rake as like a I think it's a negative connotation in a way in society, but at the same time, I don't think it's meant to describe someone as like a bad guy, like that they have bad intentions. I think there are rakes who do have intentions that are, I'm going to seduce anybody, anywhere, anytime, damn the consequences. But that's never been my understanding of rakes, at least. It's always been more of like, I'm going to take my pleasure and I'm going to deliver pleasure, like a Lothario in a way of seducing, whether it's married women or virgins, you know, whoever it might be. But I've never thought of them as having like malintent.
Well, it's not necessarily malintent. It's more like no intent. Like, like they do it for the fun. They do it for the challenge, and they're not doing it to harm anyone. It's just, you know, to put another notch in their belt and not really think about how this might harm someone. And I never got the impression that he was like that.
Okay.
He and Finn and Dom talk about how promiscuous Kieran is. So, you know, if we were able to see him with another woman, I think it would reinforce what we learn about him later on, and that the pleasure of the woman is just as important to him as his own pleasure.
I will say he's not the only one that talks about it, though, too, because she's heard from multiple sources that
what he's like.
He's got a big dick. He's a generous lover. That all this stuff. And we see even before he recognizes her as Salome for the first time, he does come on to her thinking like, ooh. So I liked that we got to see that flirtation. We got to hear about some of his like past exploits. I do wonder, like, I am interested in the idea of like what my response to him would have been if we had seen him with somebody else in the beginning. And again, it's I won't know because it's not in the book, but it's something that I would like other authors to consider moving forward. I think for some people it would be very polarizing. I think that's the reason we don't see it in a lot of books. I don't think it should be polarizing, but I think that's just kind of where, because we haven't normalized it, that's sort of where we're at. So I would like to see it more. I'm with you.
Yeah. It you know, to me, it shouldn't be polarizing, because if he's talking about it all the time, if it's in the gossip, you know, so we're supposed to know about this. We're supposed to know he's like this, but I'm very much a show don't tell kind of person.
Amen.
As a writer and as a reader. You know, I think we've all been in situations where guys talk like this and they're absolutely not this.
There's no reason this couldn't be for women either. Like, I know from, it was either last year or the year before when Scarlett Peckham's book, The Rakes, came out. We did see her with more than one gentleman suitor because that was her calling card. She was the Rakes. Right. That was what people knew her for, and
that's what they know him for. Yeah. So show us.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's something that I would like to see moving forward. I think there's ways to handle it that I think there's some ways not to handle it, but I do think that it can be done, and I think that it should be done because I also would love to see it in contemporary romance too, because for some reason especially heroine, when they first hook up with a man, the hero of the story, she usually hasn't had sex in like 4 years when they get together. So I mean,
and she's a widow or a divorcee, so you know there's a reason why she hasn't had sex in all this time, and she hasn't had a sexual partner.
Does not have to mean sexless. It can, but it doesn't have to, and so anyway, I didn't give my score. I'm going with an 8 as well, just to keep it brief. For me, if you're going to breach that 9 or 10 category, we've got to add in some kink. We've got to add in some butt stuff. We've got to add in some toys. Only thing missing from this book besides vampires. So,
and they did have toys in this era.
Absolutely.
You know, the widow's helper.
Who knows? Maybe Finn.
You know, the captain's wife's helper.
Maybe Finn will turn out to be like the super kinky one of the three of them and have like, he's like, yeah, I'm playing cards, but really I have like a sex dungeon. Like, we can only hope. But Yeah, well, what do you think? Do you think you'll read the next 2 books in the series?
Honestly, I don't know. It really depends upon how big the stack is by the side of the bed at the time that they come out.
Isn't that the life?
It was fun to read, but
Mhm.
I honestly don't think that it's something that would be my first choice,
Yeah.
my first choice to pick out at the
Okay.
bookstore. Like I said, because I didn't know that this was like going to be the first of a series, and because nothing on the book indicates that it's the first of a series, at least on the Kindle version that
No.
I have. The frustration that I felt at the end that, there's all this focus on Kieran and not on the other boys. And it's like, well, the book's almost over. They all have to get married. Why are the other two seeming like they don't care? And also the fact that the family doesn't seem in a rush to marry off Simon, which is one of the things that to me kind of felt like queer coding, the older brother not having anything. And realistically, that's the brother that they should be marrying off first.
I'm still confused by Simon's character in general, just because like the family is so attached to him, and like we didn't talk about it as much, but the whole idea that like they're always like taking him to all these events and like wanting to teach him things and have him be more well-rounded and cultured, and that's something that Kieran wasn't invited to or ever, it wasn't given to him either, because you're just the second
that one
son.
flashback scene was so heartbreaking.
Yes, and then poor Finn, they treat as an idiot, and then Finn, because I think just because he's on the quieter side, I think he kind of then takes advantage of that to be like, okay, you know what, you think I'm stupid, I'm just going to keep my mouth shut and like keep an eye on everything that's going on. And so I am curious what's going on with their family. Like, I do put it this way, I'm for sure going to read the next 2 books. Like I said, I was like drawn into this one real quick. And I'm really, there are some unanswered questions that I have about like the family dynamics. I do want to figure out, I do want to see how Finn gets his happy ending. I do want to see how Dom gets his happy ending. And there's some side characters that I'm now like concerned about. I'm like, I want to know what happens with them too.
Right. Like in the gambling hall where the Earl comes in and demands of Kieran, where's your brother? And, he's like, oh, well, Finn's over there. And he's like, not Finn, Simon. And he's really surprised. And this like happens
it's early,
fairly early in the book. And then nothing ever comes of it.
I think there's some shady deal going down. You think it's like a love affair. I think there's like something shady going on, but I have no idea. These are all things, again, that I'm assuming will be addressed, especially in Finn's book, considering that's like...
It's Finn's brother.
Yeah.
Right.
We'll see. But in the meantime... Thanks so much for joining me and talking about this one.
Oh, you're welcome. This has been so much fun.
Yay!
I've had such a good time.
And you've introduced me to like 50 years worth of British UK soap opera that I need to check out.
Right? Yeah.
So thanks for that, because my watch list wasn't long enough. Now I've just got one more thing to add to it. Thanks so much for listening. Boobies and Newbies is part of the Frolic Podcast Network. Find more podcasts you'll love at frolic.media/podcasts. You can follow Boobies and Newbies on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Boobies Podcast.